Hello. Alright everybody, welcome along this evening. What are we wanting to talk about tonight? We've got plenty of different things that we can cover, as usual. Similar to last week, I don't have anything in particular planned for this evening, so if there's anything people want to specifically ask questions about or work on, then that's the plan for tonight at least. So feel free to throw suggestions in the chat there. Assign user to log into a session. Okay, let's see, so we end up, let me quickly refresh us on what we ended up doing last week. So I think we got a bunch of the way there with that last time. We can go over it again to a little bit. Assign user login to a session, okay. To quickly refresh myself on what we had in there. Alright, well, let's go ahead and take a look at the code that we ended up with last week. So I'll just pull that up over here. Okay, so here's our server code from last week. And what else have we got? Our update.js is just there. And where's my client code? Let's find that as well. Right. Oh, F in the chat. What's up with that? Is that just how crazy the code looks at the moment? let's take a quick look again and remind ourselves of what we ended up with last time. Let me just see if I can find the database that we had from last time and get that going. WDC. I think that's it just there. Let's just check that over. Alright, so at the moment we are just having a quick check to see. At least if we have a working SQL server for this to all play nice with. DB. Did I call it DB? Probably. Let's find out. Should we database super login? No, that's not our database that we used last time. Let's try. I'm just restarting the server at the moment. Okay. Oop, that's not it either. So at the moment we're just trying to... Any ideas, any chance we could get some ideas about what the exam will be like? Yeah, absolutely, we can have a chat about the exam this evening as well. I'll add that to the list. Wrong mouse. Too many mice. Okay. Let's see, so... So just trying to find a copy of the SQL that we were using last time, which I can't seem to, but we'll just take a look at the Node.js side of things anyway, and we'll go from there. So, alright, what have we got going on here? So, first of all, we've got our app.js, a lot of the same stuff that we were looking at previously in there. So we've got loading up our SQL middleware, or our SQL library, loading up our Express library, setting up our SQL connection to the database. So in this case, the host would be a local host. So this is a database on this machine here, my machine, and the database's name was called superlogin, which I've just been trying to find for the past couple of minutes to see if there was if I had a copy of that database from last time, but I can't seem to find it, so I'm guessing I created the database in my temp directory, which is always a bad idea if I'm planning on keeping stuff around later on, so we'll see about that. Okay, so then what have we got? We've got all of our usual stuff here. This is where I've initialized my session, just with like the basic session and secret and nothing else for the moment. And then what have we got going on here? So this is the middleware that we set up to interact with the database. And then that was it for the stuff that we've added to or changed in app.js. So that's all fine. Let's take a look at index.js. Alright, well we could probably just create this database now anyway if we really wanted to, so I might just go ahead and do that. We'll go ahead and create a database table real quickly. Nice. Yeah, I think someone's trying out some cross-site scripting going on up in here. Nice try, people. But I appreciate your enthusiasm there. I think we can all probably expect that Google, of all people, are not particularly vulnerable to cross-site scripting anymore, albeit even though Twitter was fairly recently had a cross-site scripting bug, or at least a few, 2 to 3 years ago they had a pretty big one crop up in their system there. So, but again, nice try. Okay, that should do it. So I'm just reconfiguring the database at the moment. Okay, alright, I know we haven't really been doing anything on the screen for you there, but so what we've got is a database that we've just gone ahead and set up to match the database that we've got going on in here. So I've got my users table, which has ID, name, email, and password hash in it. And we can go ahead and create a user in this table if we want to. So this is very quickly what it looks like. I've just created like a really quick primary key. I haven't done any foreign keys or anything like that, and I've just set everything else to a 50-character string. So that's what's going on there. So how did we go about making this login work? Well, Yeah, again, I reckon Google's probably escaping all of their stuff that goes into chat, but nice try on that. So, right, how did our login end up working? So, in a nutshell, the system would initialize a session for every request that comes through if it didn't already have a session attached to it. So, there we go. That's where we set up a super secret session on all incoming requests. And I believe there's a couple extra things that we usually add to this, which is something to the effect of save uninitialized and save something or other. Can't remember exactly what. That's okay. We'll just leave it at this for the moment. So that creates the session on every single packet that comes through. I'll just see if I can find the actual API for that. Right, so here's the actual API for the Express Session middleware with all the correct options. There we go. So we can see an example there. So if we actually make that the full just leave it as my super secret session. Okay, alright, so very quickly, what are the options that we've got in here? So we've got the secret option, which is a private key that's used to encrypt and decrypt session tokens. We have the resave option, which is set to false, which tells us whether we want to reset our session on the server every time, like make a new copy. Will this code be available after the live stream? Yes, I know I said I'd make this code available after last live stream as well, so yes, we'll make sure that this code is eventually available. It's on the list. We'll try to make it available a little bit sooner, probably straight afterwards in this case. We have a save uninitialized, which is set to true. This means that whenever a request comes through the system, it will initialize the session regardless. So in some cases you might have save uninitialized set to false, where you only initialize the session if you actually want to, but not by default. Whereas in this case, we want the session to always be initialized on all requests coming through the system. And then we have the cookie, which is secure as true at the moment. We can go with secure false because we're using regular HTTP instead of HTTPS. So that's our app.js. And it's connecting to a database called superlogin, which is the database that we've set up just here, which you can see there. So, okay, so what happens? The session gets initialized when any request comes through. That request goes into the corresponding router files, and actually, did we ever end up doing anything with users.js in this file? Not 100 in this demo, not sure, let's find out. Nope, nothing in users.js for this particular demo. Okay, so we've got a post request that comes through for the login route, and what we're going to do is we are going to hash the password, and we're going to create a hash of the password, and we're also going to have the email. So the email comes in the request body, and the password is a hash of the password, which we've got just there. We could just use request body pass and use MySQL's inbuilt hashing functions, which, you know what, we might as well just go ahead and do that right now, because that seems like a fairly reasonable thing to do, I think. So that way we don't have to bother with the hashing it on our end. We can do the hashing in the database. So req dot and password hash equals. So for this, I'm just going to quickly check the MySQL reference. I say, it's probably floating around here in the crypto function section. There we go, SHA-2. Alright, so this is how we would go about using SHA-2 for hashing. So let's use the hashing in our database this time instead for good measure. So alright, 256. Okay, so that'll do a SHA-256 hash of the password and compare that to the password hash variable. So let's go ahead and create a user real quick in the database. Again, we did this last time, but we'll need to refresh this. Because I'm manually creating the user, I'm going to have to manually create the password hash. So let's go ahead and create that password hash. So hash. In this case, I'm just going to use the password as password. So there's our hash just there. We can copy that. And then we're going to create this user in the database. So insert into users. Okay, insert into users. Values. Okay, so ID we'll set to 1. Name. It's going to be Jane. I feel like that's what we used last year. Email jane@example.example. Is it just you or is this really quiet? That's a good question. Let's see if it's really quiet. Test. Yeah, you know what? I think that could probably be a little bit louder, I would say. So let's, give me a second here. I'll just hop over. Huh, yeah, no, that looks pretty quiet there. How about now? Is that maybe a little bit more? Oh, it's doing that again. For some reason it split the left channel a little bit, one of the channels a little bit higher. We might just roll with that for the moment. Is that better? Two. The levels look a little bit better over here. Okay, alright, glad that's easier to hear now. Feel free to just tell me that in general, people, if that happens again, but I'll try to make a note next time. Sorry that the balance is a little bit out. I'm not sure why it does that. Anyway, right, okay, so we've got our password hash, so that's my volume settings, we can just close that. Alright, so user email password hash, I should probably make sure to actually put all of these in quotes, because we've got a bunch of strings going on here, except for that ID. Yep. Data too long for pass. Did I use more than? It's probably 64, isn't it? I reckon it's going to be 64. Okay. I'm going to have to quickly check my alter table syntax over here. Don't do that very often. Alright. There we go. Okay, alter table, users, modify, column, password hash, char 64. Did I spell that wrong? Ah, I did very much spell that wrong. We'll remove the old one as well. Okay, alright, that looks a little bit better. Okay, alright, so what did we just do? Okay, so we created our new user account just here, and that's Jane with her email and her ID and all of that jazz there. So, and with the password hash. So, over here in our code just there, we should be taking the password and hashing it, and then checking that against the database with that particular query just there. What else have we got there? We've got the email address, which is going to be used to check against the user's email. So that's all well and good. So what happens? The user requests the login page, and if the login page is requested successfully, then we go ahead, acquire a connection to the database, and run a query against the database to see if the user details that have been provided as part of the login route are valid user details. So we select the user ID and the name from users where email is question mark and password hash is a SHA-256 hash of question mark, where question marks are request.body.email in the first instance and request.body.pass in the second instance. So it's some JSON that we're just sending over with email and password. Once we have completed that query, we will release our connection to the database so that everything, another request can use the database. And we're going to print out onto the console what we've actually gotten back from the database. Then we take a look. Now, we have two options here. If we have a result of one or more rows, then we know that the credentials provided are valid. If we don't have any rows in the result, then there is no combination of email and password hash that matches what was sent by the user. So we can send a 403 in that case. What do we have on the client side? So I had a very simple two inputs here, a email input and a password input, and a button which you click it runs this login function. The login function creates a new AJAX request and sends it as a post request to the login route there. We explicitly say, hey, this is a JSON request, that's nice. And then we've got the email and the password, which are the email from the document, which refers to this input just here. And then the password is referring to this input here. So we get the value of both of those inputs. We send them inside a JSON object, and we stringify that object, send it to the server side. When the server responds back, either with a 200 containing the data of the logged in user, or it's going to respond back with a 403, in which case we know that there wasn't a valid user for that request. So I can put up an alert box either way, depending on what's happened. So let's take a quick look and see what we've got there. Okay. Alright, so that's all that there, which is nice. Let's start our server up. Hopefully that all works. Would have expected it to do more by now. Okay, well we'll give that a second. It hasn't thrown any errors at us, so we can try. And I think it was /login was the page we were going for. There we go. There's our login page just there. You can see that's our server responding to those routes. Let's try logging in. So I'll log in with incorrect user details. There we go, username, password incorrect. What's happened on the server there? You can see that the database query response has come back with nothing. But if I try, I think it was Jane at example.example and password is the password, then we get Jane's details back and it says welcome Jane, and you can see that the response came back from the database was an ID of 1 and name of Jane, so we logged in successfully. So going back to our original question, it was how do we assign a user login to a session? Alright, so bit of a long way around to get to where we got to. So yes, last time we did, okay, this is how you do an actual login. How do we assign it to a session? Okay, well, let's take a quick look. So this is going to be in one of our JavaScript files. Now in this case, what I might do is I might open my session up in my users.js file, potentially. Yeah, okay, let's go ahead and do that. Let's do this in the users.js. So this is the function that, or the code that will actually log us in successfully, so that's nice. So you can see here that I've set something called the user ID on my session to be, in this case, row0.id. So it's going to grab the ID of the matching user out of the database query result, and it's going to store that ID in req.session.userid. Now this user ID is stored against the server, so if I use req.session.userid somewhere else in any of my other routes, so for example if I have a route for, let's just say a GET request for, I don't know, what do we reckon? GET request for maybe, I don't know, just hello, we'll call it hello. So let's say that I've got myself a GET request for hello. I'm just going to copy my basic stuff here from this route. Okay. So what we can do is we can say if user ID in session, sorry, req.session. So if user ID is in req.session, then that's going to be this value just here that we had set up. So we can, in this case, .log user ID. Alright, so then I'll just spit out onto my server's terminal the user ID, otherwise logged in. Okay. Alright, so I'm going to print out not logged in if the user hadn't already logged in ahead of time. Otherwise I'm going to print out the user ID which we had attached to the session if they did log in correctly. Yes, hello, Jagadish, how's it going? Alright, so we were just going through how we can use some session stuff. So yeah, that's what we're looking at the moment. So we looked at the login system that we talked about last time, and now we're looking at our sessions, how we can use the sessions. So we did set a user ID property on the session last time, and then we can pick that up and start using that in other routes if we want to. So this one will just print out on the server's terminal the user ID of the currently logged in user, or it's going to print out that the current user is not logged in. So let's go ahead and give that a quick test over. So I'm going to start my server up again, and I should probably actually respond with something. So res dot, you know what, I'll use a res dot redirect in this case to redirect the page to /login. Alright, let's give that a quick go. So again, we'll restart that server. Now I'm expecting that the system will have recalled my session already. We'll be saving my session between uses, but if it doesn't, that's okay. We only really need the session to be stored while everything's running. So let's take a quick look and see what we've got going on there. So we're going to redirect to login HTML if the user is not logged in already. Otherwise, we're going to redirect to just index, which is the standard welcome to Express page that we're used to seeing. So let's take a look here. /hello. Alright, so it's redirected me to the login page because I haven't been logged in, but if I, and what's actually showing on my terminal just here, so you can see not logged in, redirected in that case. So if I try and log in as Jane now, alright, log in as Jane, alright, it says welcome Jane, that's all good. And it redirects me back to my main page, and you can see that when I went to log in that time, instead of printing out not logged in as it did here, it's printed out 1, which is Jane's user ID, which was what I was storing against the session. So now that I have that user ID stored against the session, what can I do with it? Well, I can use it to query the database again if I want to. So for example, I can do something like we can do something like just gonna put a nice copy of all of this right into here. Now note, because I'm doing a database query and the stuff in here is going to be the last thing to run regardless, so we want to put anything that we do at the very end of this. Okay, so for example, I could do something like select name, email from users where ID equals question mark. Because the user's already logged in at this point, we can just use the user ID like that. So because the user ID is now stored against the session, we can use the user ID as part of regular database queries that we'll be making otherwise. So I've just got a very basic database query that's going to spit out the name and the email of the currently logged in user, and we'll be dumping that onto the console and then redirecting the same way as we did just before. So let's take a quick look at that, restart my server. Probably need to log Jane back in again for good measure. Need the full email. Alright, so that logged in successfully. And now if we go to our hello, you can see it takes me to the main page, which is nice. And you can see, here we go, it's spat out the name and the email based on the fact that the ID of the user was 1. So we can then use that ID again and again in our queries to, or as the basis of our queries to grab the information that we need. So in this case, having the ID, which is of course the primary key of that user, saved against the user's session is useful. We could also save more information. We could save the entire row of the database against the user's session if we really wanted to. So including a copy of, Jane's name, Jane's email, maybe not Jane's password, that's probably a bad idea, but that means that we can, by storing that information against the session, we can easily retrieve it just by using req.session. whatever the field name is that we want to be working with. Right, so that is assigning it. Well, yeah, that's assigning a user login to a session. So we're already doing it a little bit, but this is how we go about actually using it, which is nice. So with that in mind, does anyone have any questions or thoughts about that before we maybe take a quick look at some exam stuff? Getting some ideas about what the exam will be like. What are we thinking, people? All right, okay, let's go ahead and take a look at a past exam then, and go from there. So let's pull one up, shall we? Okay, so what I've got here is I've got 2015. Now I haven't really had a chance to review this to see how representative it's going to be of the main exam, but let's take a look at it and see what we've actually got going on. So very quickly, I'll outline this now, but we'll talk about in actual detail in a bit more. So the exam is going to be consistent of a few different bits and pieces. So hang on 1 second. Okay, so the exam is going to be roughly made up of the same composition of stuff that you'll see across the semester. So to give you an actual breakdown of how it's going to work, you are going to have... Ooh, how do we do this? Okay, so we're going to be talking HTML. And okay, so the exam, it's a 2-hour long exam is the first thing. So it's going to be 120 minutes. And I'll just quickly scooch this over a little bit so that we can see. Okay, so the exam is going to be 120 minutes long. There's going to be 120 marks, so roughly 1 mark per minute in the exam. The mark breakdown will be something as follows. We're going to spend 20 marks on HTML and CSS. There's going to be, I believe, I'm just trying to remember the exact order off the top of my head, but something to the effect of 20 marks on JavaScript and Vue. There's going to be 10 marks on usability, and I will actually talk about this in week 13 when we get to a lecture in week 13. I will actually give this breakdown again for everybody. 10 marks, usability and accessibility. Then we're going to have 30 marks. Now I'm getting pedantic. All right, we're going to have 30 marks for server / networking / node. So all the server stuff and basic network theory and the things that we're talking about there. We're going to have 30 marks on the database. And finally, 10 marks on security. And the reason why I'm open about this marks breakdown is because it's no accident that the marks are broken down this way. This is directly proportional to the amount of time that we spend on each of these things across the semester. So we spent 2 weeks talking about HTML and CSS out of a 12-week course. So at 10 marks per week across 2 weeks, that's 20 marks. We spent 2 weeks talking about JavaScript and Vue and client side. So there's going to be 20 marks in there. We spent 1 week talking usability and accessibility, so 10 marks for that. 1 week, 10 marks. We spent 3 weeks talking server, network, Node.js, and also a little bit of Ajax and other stuff in there. 3 weeks, 30 marks. We've spent 3 weeks talking database stuff. 3 weeks, 30 marks. And we'll be spending week 12 talking about security. So there will absolutely be a security question in the exam. And that one's going to be worth 10 marks. Again, I will go over this breakdown in week 13 when we actually talk about the exam. The question asked here is the exam composed of multiple choice questions or essay questions or a combination of both? It's going to be more essay questions, but there's also going to be some, I guess, programming / debugging type questions. So let's take a look at 2015. And see what's in there, and we'll talk a bit about some of the questions in there. So here's 2015's exam. So you can see, here we go, 120 marks. I'm not sure that the breakdown is the same, but let's take a look. So, HTML, CSS design. So it's asking you to identify usability and accessibility issues within this particular piece of HTML. Okay, that's fair enough. Here's one where you get given a piece of HTML and you get asked to draw what that HTML is going to look like in a browser window. So this is kind of the type of question that is representative of what types of questions you might actually see in the exam. So there will be questions where we get you to stuff like this: explain the difference between class and ID selectors. So explaining something. I'll just quick slide back over to small me for a moment. Okay, so there will be questions such as in this case where it's like, okay, go ahead and explain something, explain the difference, compare and contrast different sorts of things. They are going to be theory-focused questions as opposed to getting you to write code from scratch kind of questions, or they're going to be asking you to look at a piece of code and make some minor modifications or something to it. So, alright, so there's an example of both of those. That's mostly going to be what the exam is going to be made up of. So here we go. Here's a question asking you to take a look at some Ajax code, and it's just asking you, okay, well, what does this particular line of the Ajax code do? So understanding what bits and pieces of code actually do. Why are we using post instead of get? That's something there. Explain what localhost and 3000 in a URL mean. That's a thing there. Talk about different HTTP status codes. That's nice. So I would say that probably the types of the types of questions that you're seeing in this exam are somewhat representative of the types of questions that you'll see in the main exam, albeit the questions will be different this year. This year's exam has been written from scratch because it's not ideal to just reuse the same questions from past years. As much as that would save me a bit of time, yeah, there's been an emphasis on trying to make sure that the exam is both representative of what we've talked about in the course, and also that the questions are not just the same questions from last year, so that you can't just regurgitate an answer back up. So a lot of what we're asking you to do in the exam is going to be demonstrate your understanding by explaining things. Easy questions for you all. That is a good... I mean, I hope they are. I mean, put it like this: if you've been doing the practicals and you've been understanding the practicals and you're going okay on your group projects, then hopefully the questions will be fairly straightforward for you to do. Let's take a quick look at what else we've got here. There we go. What is a cookie? Explain the role of middleware. Here are some more questions. Even though we did talk about APIs, we only really briefly touched on them, and I'm not going to be asking you to give me specific information about specific APIs in the exam. Let's see there. Explain some code. So this is here we go. We've got some code here that deals with a map API. That's nice. Database. All right. Here we go. So a database question. It might be reasonable to see a question similar to this in the databases section. So where you get given a description of a scenario. Okay, so here's a scenario here. So we've got one or more textbooks is recommended for each course. Each textbook is used at least in at least one course. A textbook is identified by a unique ISBN, its title, authors, publisher, and the year of publication unknown. Each course has a unique code. So then you want to develop an entity relationship model for the scenario below, and then derive a relation schema from that, and then perhaps you're going to write some queries for that database or bits and pieces there. So it wouldn't be unreasonable to see a question somewhat similar to this in the database section. The security section has changed a little bit, and I'm not going to go into that one too much. So the questions that you see here in the security section are sort of general theory questions. This year you're going to get more of a focus on actually sort of looking at and analyzing code and trying to possibly execute your own attacks, that sort of thing, which you'll get some practice at doing in the practical exercises. So looking at code, sort of going, right, well, is this vulnerable to an attack? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. What type of attack is it vulnerable to? Those sorts of things. That's the kind of question that you're probably going to get in the security section rather than something like this. So that's all I have to say about the exam for the moment. Obviously can't give too much away, but hopefully that sort of answers your main questions. I will be putting up a selection of the past exams for you all to take a look at over the coming week. And then you can start having a look at those and using them to partially guide your revision, but try not to rely too heavily on them because, as I said, this is a new exam this year. We're not using any questions from previous years in this exam. Yeah. All right. All right. Any other questions or thoughts for this evening's live stream? And how is marking going to be ... Not 100% sure what that question means. Could you expand on that a little bit? I mean, I suppose marking will... Yeah, I'm really not sure how to answer that. Like, I'm not gonna... We're not gonna try and be, like, super brutal on you or anything like that, but... It's a very... your interpretation of what a reasonable versus a challenging marking scheme could be different than my interpretation, so it's a little bit subjective in that regard. We'll try to give you the benefit of the doubt where possible, especially if you're only making minor mistakes, but a lot of the questions that we're asking specifically require you to demonstrate your understanding through explanation, and if your explanations are just completely off the mark, or if they don't actually demonstrate any understanding, then you're not going to get the marks. So we'll try and give you the benefit of the doubt where possible, but it's not super easy to do necessarily. So how is marking going to be in the exam? Like, what do you expect for each question? Definitions, examples. Well, okay, I suppose... What sorts of questions can we expect in the accessibility section? Okay, all right. Well, first of all, as far as for each question's definitions, examples, hopefully the question text will actually make it clear what we're expecting. So, like an explanation or whether we expect you to provide examples or not. The question will usually ask you to provide examples if we're actually expecting you to provide examples, but don't be afraid to put examples in. Each question has a certain number of marks assigned to it. As we've mentioned, there are 120 marks, 120 minutes. So I don't expect you to be spending 20 minutes to try and answer a question, 20 minutes writing a very detailed, long-winded explanation for a question that's only worth 5 marks. You should be spending at most 5 minutes on a 5-mark question, hopefully less than 3 minutes to answer a 5-mark question. In theory, someone who knows what they're doing should be able to complete the exam easily within the 120-minute mark, and ideally in about half of that time. That's someone who's really on top of and really knows what's going on. So if I give the exam to course coordinator Cheryl, for example, and she can't complete it in around 60 to 90 minutes, then the exam's probably too difficult. So we don't expect you to be spending ages and ages and ages of time on questions that are only worth a few marks. So please, by all means, summarize and use dot points where possible, because that's going to save, at least it's going to make it more clear and easy for us to mark. There's nothing I hate more as a marker than getting a long-winded essay answer to a question that's not worth very many marks and then having that answer completely miss the point, because it's wasting my time, it's wasting your time in the exam, and it's wasting my time as a marker to have to go through that much detail for no reasonable outcomes. So feel free to make your answers as concise as possible. Do we have a hurdle requirement for this course? The exam contributes, that's a good question. Yes, it's a hurdle requirement. I can tell you that straight off the top of my head. Let me just quickly remember what, I think it's 55%, but let me check that. You want to, you know what, I'll just pull up the page that says it for that. Where is it? While I'm doing that, what sorts of questions can we expect in the accessibility section? That is a good question. So in the accessibility section of the course, we talked about a few things. We talked about general principles of design. We talked about the WCAG accessibility guidelines and the sort of guiding principles for those. So I would make sure that I'm familiar with the WCAG guidelines and the general principles that they encompass. We also talked about cognitive and kinematic load, so that's something that we certainly want to think about. And we talked about semantic HTML and how that improves accessibility, and also semantic understanding of our website by robots. So which results in better search engine results and search engine optimization. So those are the things that we want to think about in the accessibility section of the course. It really was only 2 lectures that we talked about that stuff in any amount of detail. So have a look through those 2 lectures and try and familiarize yourself with the general gist of things that are going on in there. I can tell you that the accessibility questions that will be in past exams probably aren't very representative of the accessibility questions that you'll see in this year's exam. So make sure you familiarize yourself with the actual content that we've covered for that. Let's just take a quick look here. It's like the page is there in the overview section of the course on My Uni, but actually I think the introduction, the first lecture actually covers it probably a little bit better. So where is it? Okay, so here's our assessment section just here. So that's the current breakdown for the assessment for the course. So you can see quizzes are 5%, prac exercises 15, group assignment 25. So I believe that's 45% all up. Well, as you can tell, yes, so the exam is 55% with a 40% hurdle on it. So you need, yes, 48 indeed, 48 out of 120 to meet the hurdle requirement, yes. Hopefully that covers all of your questions about the exams, everyone. What are we thinking at this point about everything else? Any other questions? You know, there's a pretty solid delay on the stream, so we'll just wait a second for that to... When will the marks be out for the milestone submission? Ooh, that is a good question. It's right near the top of my list at the moment, so you can expect the marks for the milestone submission within a day, I would say, pending our other markers completing their marking of submissions. So yeah, you should be getting marks out in the next day for your milestone 1 submission. All good. All right, well, if no one has any other questions, I'm going to end it for this evening, which is a little bit earlier than the previous streams, but I think keeping it to an hour has probably been a good thing, at least. So I'll just give it a little bit longer just to see if anyone else has any questions that they want to ask. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and call it there for the evening. All right. Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions popping up, so I think we will go ahead and call it there. Right. Have a good evening, everyone, and we'll see you all Friday.